Everyone to this timely and important webcast from the League of Women Voters. I'm Catherine Bealey, President of the Utah League, and I'm so happy to introduce our speaker tonight, Ben Sheehan. Ben is not only the author of the book we'll be talking about, he's a well-known political commentator and lecturer, and he's also basically one of us. Why do I say that? Ben spent the last few election cycles using media and events to increase civic participation among young voters. As executive director of Save the Day PAC, Ben led the organization's video and content efforts to register 50,000 new voters under 40. In 2018, he founded OMG WTF. It's not what you think it is. Those acronyms actually stand for Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, Texas, and Florida, to teach voters about overlooked races during the midterms. That project led to gerrymandered jewelry, a finalist for Fast Company's World-Changing Ideas, as well as hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations to state executive candidates and voter turnout efforts. Aside from politics, Ben is a former award-winning producer at Funny or Die, responsible for some of the site's biggest hits. Originally from the DC area, Ben graduated with high honors from Emory University and holds an MA from New York University. In 2018, he was named one of the entertainment industry's Next Gen 35 rising executives under 35. In total, the videos he's been involved with have received over 1 billion views. So we'll see how he does tonight. Thank you, Ben Sheehan, for being here. And before we get started, I'd just like to say how honored we are to be joined by our National League President, Dr. Deborah Ann Turner. I'm going to turn this over to her for a few introductory remarks, after which we will move to Catherine Weller of Weller Bookworks and the League's past president, who will monitor this event. Dr. Turner, take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Yes, as Catherine said, I am Dr. Deborah Ann Turner, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States, and I am delighted to be here with you tonight for this enlightening webinar and to hear from Ben. First, I have to give a shout out to my friends in the League of Women Voters of Utah for all the hard and extraordinary work you are doing in your state to carry out the mission of the League, to empower voters and defend democracy. You know, at the League, we are dedicated to empowering voters through education, advocating for fair and accessible elections, and stepping up to the plate to protect our democracy at all levels by working in communities to promote tools like Vote 411 that provide trusted candidate information, by dismantling the spread of misinformation, by build trust in our elections, and by building power for the people with our partners as we come together to speak with one voice. We do not stand by and allow communities of voters to be suppressed. We do not stand by and watch our access to free and fair elections be destroyed. And we are not afraid to shut down the use of mis and disinformation, which undermines our democracy. We are 52 state leagues strong, 800 local leagues plus, and over 60,000 members strong, 103 years old, and dedicated to nonpartisanship and making DEI part of our DNA. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Sheehan, and I appreciate the fact we will be talking about the League's next North Star, the election of the president and vice president by direct vote, which will require the elimination of the Electoral College. So thank you for letting me be here, and I look forward to the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. I'm Catherine Weller, as previously introduced, with the League of Women Voters, and I am so excited to be here tonight with everybody. And thank you to you, Ben, for joining us. Talking about the Constitution with you for the next little while is going to be the highlight of possibly my months. And we're talking December, so that's a good thing. Before we start, I need to remind listeners that we've set aside time for questions and answers at the end of this seminar. So there'll be plenty of time for your questions. If you do have a question, please enter that into the Q&A box. The chat box has been disabled, but I will be monitoring the Q&A box and will ask the questions that are posted there at the end. We have had a couple of questions emailed to us, and I'll be asking those as well. So to start, Ben, as I said, your book is great. It treats the Constitution article by article, section by section, amendment by amendment. And I love the way you've structured it, the way you start with the Constitution's actual language and then restate it in modern English that is easier to understand is terrific. And the context you add is really helpful. We could spend the entirety of this webinar approaching the Constitution in a similar fashion, that amendment by amendment. But as Dr. Turner just stated, the League has a couple of issues that we have some big concerns about right now. And there are a few concepts that we here in Utah grapple with some regularity. So I want to dig right into those, and let's talk about the Electoral College, Ben.
Let's talk about it. It's as old as the Constitution itself. It's had some changes. It was almost done away with in 1969. That was the closest we ever got to almost getting it through the House and the Senate and to the states for ratification. Unfortunately, it was filibustered by none other than Strom Thurmond and several of his friends. I think the most common misconception about the Electoral College is that going back to the origination of it, that it was the debate was between having a popular vote and the Electoral College. The debate was actually at the convention having either the popular vote for president or actually Congress picking the president. In fact, for most of the convention, that was the understanding, was that Congress was going to choose the president. In most states, the state legislature at the time chose the governor, so it seemed like a logical extension of that. And the ideas that the delegates, the founders went through was, well, either we could have Congress choose the president, we could have state legislatures choose the president, or we could have a direct popular vote. And they couldn't really agree on which one of these to go with, and each one had its own issues. So they kind of, at the end, combined them all into some sort of hodgepodge, right? So, instead of Congress picking the president, we have electors, people who don't have power. And the concern there was that, well, if Congress picks the president and the president has veto power, then the president might not want to veto laws if he's vetoing laws from the people who give him his power. So they didn't want to do that. So ultimately came up with a system where state legislators choose the manner of choosing the electors. They can use a popular vote. And we've had this system now for well over 200 years. And I think people would be, when I talk about the Electoral College with a lot of audiences, especially younger audiences, they're surprised to learn that we don't actually have the right to vote for president at all. The same state legislatures that give us the ability to use a popular vote to determine the electors, they can also take that away from us. That was actually affirmed in 2000 in Bush v. Gore. So it's an incredibly strange system for choosing a president. It's very unique in many ways to the United States. And it also has some pretty ugly ties back to slavery. So originally at the Constitutional Convention, as I mentioned, there was debate about how to pick the president. And part of that debate was finding a way where, southern states and northern states could each have some similarity to say. At the time, they each had about the same in population, around 1.8 million each. But in southern states, far fewer of those people could actually vote. So they had to find a way where southern states would vote for the Constitution without having their voting power diminished in proportion to northern states. And so what happened is that by having the Electoral College based on the number in each state, based on representatives plus senators, how are representatives chosen? It's by proportion, and the population in each state. How did they count the population at the time? Well, we know that free people counted as one. People who were indentured servants serving for a fixed amount of time counted as one as well. Native Americans who didn't pay taxes didn't count as all, and all other persons, which we know means enslaved people, counted as 3/5. So by proxy of that, that means there were electoral votes in southern states just based on an enslaved population that couldn't vote, that was in additional to the people who actually could. So if you look at the election of 1800, originally in the first iteration of the Electoral College, before Congress voted and couldn't break the tie, and it's a long story. It was covered in Hamilton, if anybody saw that musical. But Thomas Jefferson initially got enough electoral votes over his opponent just by counting the electoral votes based on the enslaved population in southern states who obviously could not themselves vote. So not only is it an antiquated compromise from 200 plus years ago, it has its roots in appeasing southern states to go along with the Constitution by playing to the fact that they owned enslaved people. And, you know, it's clearly not helpful or representative, at least in my opinion, for how we should pick our leader today.
Ben, you in your book, you talk about the national popular vote and how a little bit about the National Popular Vote Compact and how that works. The two states that have their electors with the popular vote right now. Would you talk with us a little bit about that and move further into that popular vote discussion?
Sure. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, for anyone unfamiliar, is basically state legislatures can sign on that they are going to give their electors to the winner of the national popular vote instead of the winner of the popular vote in their state. And so far, you have 16, I believe the latest, because there was just another signatory this past year, I believe Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz signed on. So that brings you to 16 states plus DC for, I believe, a total of 205 electoral votes. Now, the problem with this is that you need 270 for the compact to take effect. So you need a significant number of states in order to get to that 270 number. And the other problem is that just as easily as states can join the compact, they can also remove themselves from the compact. So you could find yourself in a situation where you get to that 270 threshold, and then, you know, an election happens, and say a midterm happens, and the state legislature flips, the governorship flips, or whatever, and a state could then pass a law to remove themselves, and then the compact, you know, falls apart or is ineffective until you get back to 270. So it is true that it is a workaround for the Electoral College, the issue being that it is potentially flimsy given which states end up signing on. And there also is the fact that, you know, there is a potential constitutional challenge, because in the Constitution, it does prohibit states from making compacts or contracts with each other without the federal government's approval. And really what they meant at the time is that, you know, North Carolina and South Carolina couldn't team up and invade Maryland. It was really more of like having a defense in mind, right? But, you know, the language is in there. And so there could be a constitutional challenge, and then it would go up to the Supreme Court. So that is one potential workaround, though it has its pitfalls. The other workaround, and this is something that I don't hear discussed nearly enough, is that every state has the power, if it wanted, to switch its electoral votes from winner take all to proportional. And right now you have two states that don't do exactly that, but they do have a different system, which is Maine and Nebraska, where the winner of the statewide popular vote gets 2 electors based on those 2 state senators. And then the winner of the popular vote in each of the state's congressional districts gets 1 electoral vote based on that US representative. So that's why you have, you know, somebody, you know, I think it was in 2020, it was a split of 3-1 in Maine, where, you know, 3 went for one candidate, 1 vote went for another. You had Biden picking up, I think, Nebraska either 2 or 4, the congressional district with the capital. So you have, you know, those 2 states allowed to be split. But I'm, you know, surprised more so than states joining the compact for the popular vote, why there hasn't been more of a discussion for winner take all. My gut is that by keeping states' electoral votes winner take all, it kind of keeps the state as a potential prize. And so candidates are going to travel there and campaign there and spend money there on television advertising, on get out the vote, you know, ground efforts. And so that plays a role in the resistance to changing the system as well.
Oh, I've never thought about that before. That's a new wrinkle for me to ponder there. One of the things you just alluded to as we began talking about the Electoral College was it's kind of weird to the US, isn't it?
It is really unique. No, there are other countries that have sort of dabbled in doing something like the Electoral College, but today this is a system that is pretty much exclusively unique to the United States in terms of picking the national leader.
So even though our Constitution was the models for many other constitutions throughout the world, we are the ones that are hanging on to this.
We are, and like I said, there have been several efforts to get rid of it, and some of them came very close, but obviously none of them have been successful.
So you talked about that effort it was 1969. It was killed by a filibuster in the Senate then by Senator Thurmond.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, was it looking like it was successful?
They were close in terms of states. A lot of states had indicated that they were willing to ratify it, so they were pretty close to that 38 number that you need. And President Nixon at the time had signaled that he was willing to sign it. So there was real bipartisan agreement that this was an antiquated system. And that's the closest we ever came. But obviously, senators, I don't think it's not ironic, because I can see why it happened, but senators from mostly southern states put a stop to it, because the other element that we haven't mentioned about the Electoral College is that it does reward low population states with outsized power. So in my book, I talk about the difference between the voting age population in Texas versus Wyoming, and how much power it is proportional to each electoral vote. So if you do the math, it ends up being about 500 every 550,000 people in Texas, voting age residents of Texas, correspond to one electoral vote, and every 140,000 voting age people in Wyoming corresponds to one electoral vote. So your one electoral vote is worth significantly more in proportion to the population in Wyoming than it is in Texas, and obviously that's the same for any high population state. So small states do enjoy an advantage proportionally to the electorate from the Electoral College.
Okay, and I do think we've got different times, so it will be interesting to talk about the arguments that we hear for moving to a popular vote now. What is it that you've been hearing in terms of moving to the popular vote, or have you been hearing discussion about moving away from the Electoral College?
I mean, there's certainly, I think more in progressive circles, there's more openness to moving away from the Electoral College, but it really comes down to the population. It's hard. You need 38 states to change the Constitution, right? To ratify a constitutional amendment. It's 3/4, so that ends up being 38. And it's very hard to get to 38 states without including small states that benefit from the current system. So in order to get to that 38 number, you would have to have some states that are voting against their interest of outsized proportion that they get from the Electoral College, which is honestly a common theme across a lot of government. Is you find yourself, in order to make change, you have to have people in government who are kind of voting against their own benefit. I think about this a lot with gerrymandering, right? Or campaign finance laws. There are people who benefit from these laws being in place, and if you look at it and believe that they're unethical, you just have to hope that people in Congress, or in this case state legislatures, or really for constitutional amendments, both would put their own benefit aside for the good of the country. And who knows if that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, and it's, as we are in different times, I hear, and one of the things that we hear a lot here in Utah are discussions of how to interpret the Constitution and fidelity to the Constitution. So I imagine we're going to be hearing a lot about that in our discussion with the Electoral College too. So I want to pivot to this whole idea of originalism. It's something that we grapple a lot with. We hear about the framers. And man, even as we listen to our Supreme Court justices, or every hearing about the Supreme Court, be it for a nominee to the court or just about what the court is doing, we hear about originalism. Tell us, dive into just originalism to us about that.
Well, for something that advocates adhering to the original ideas as understood at the time for the Constitution hundreds of years ago. It's actually a pretty new philosophy. So really the beginnings of originalism date all the way back to the 1970s. A law paper written by a young Robert Bork at the time, and this idea gained traction among conservative legal circles going into the 1980s. But it really wasn't until Scalia and Alito and Thomas that you had people on the court who were self-avowed originalists. And obviously that has increased as we've seen the last several the appointments under Trump's administration. But it's a pretty recent philosophy. And the idea, in my own opinion and from my own research, is pretty antithetical to how the people who wrote the Constitution wanted us to interpret it. So I go back to a correspondence between James Madison, one of the principal authors of the Constitution, often called the father of the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson, who was not there at the writing of the Constitution, but was being informed about it through mail correspondence in France. And he wrote a letter to James Madison advocating for the fact that we should actually have new constitutions every 19 years, not amendments, brand new constitutions every 19 years, because the idea of having a constitution live longer than that is, in his words, analogous to expecting a coat that you wore as a child to fit you as an adult. Because laws change, people change, mores change, ideals change, and the founding document should change along with those belief systems. So I find it incredibly strange to square the idea of originalism with the founders' own words about how often the Constitution should change, and the fact that the vast majority of Article 5 is a guide to changing the Constitution. So if they wanted us to stick to understanding it only as they wrote it at the time and not change it, they wouldn't have given us the ability to change it in the first place.
So Article 5 itself, there are two ways to change the Constitution that are described within Article 5. Tell us a little bit more about each of those paths to a constitutional amendment or a constitutional change.
So the first way, by the way, this is the way that every single amendment that we have to the Constitution has been done. So even though that there are two paths to amending the Constitution, only one of them has ever been used to add amendments. And that is if 2/3 of Congress, so 2/3 of the House and the Senate, they propose a constitutional amendment to the states. And then you need 3/4 of states, which today is 38 states, to ratify it. And either it's the legislatures in those states or it's conventions within those states. And of the 27 amendments that we have, 26 of them have been through legislatures, and only one of them was through conventions in each state, and that was the 21st Amendment to repeal prohibition. So that is how all of our constitutional amendments have gone through Congress, but you don't actually need Congress at all to amend the Constitution. And that is if 2/3 of states, so 34 states, their legislatures, call for a constitutional convention. This is known as an Article 5 convention. And as to if that were to happen, what would happen at the convention, who knows? They didn't give us any details or a roadmap into what the process would be like at an Article 5 convention. And there are definitely movements in conservative circles. There's I forget the exact name of the organization, but there's an organization that is well funded that is trying to convince legislatures to vote for calling a constitutional convention. And it's often done under the guise of proposing a singular amendment, right? So let's call a constitutional convention to propose a balanced budget amendment. Let's do it to establish term limits, stuff like that. However, there's no rule that once the convention forms that you have to stick to that balanced budget amendment, that you have to stick to that term limits amendment. You could address other things, and it could go off the rails and change the Constitution. And people criticize that or respond to that and say, well, what, you need 38 states ultimately to ratify. So any amendments proposed at the convention have to go through 38 states. And to that I say, well, the last time we met to amend a governing document, which is when the Constitutional Convention happened and all the delegates went to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation, instead of doing that, they ended up tearing up the Articles of Confederation and writing an entirely new constitutional document. So the only reference point we have is a bunch of people meeting to reform something that exists, scrapping it entirely, and writing something brand new. So if we're going by history as our precedent, it would clearly be a concerning opportunity for people who want to have a new governing document, that they could potentially do that. So that is both the concern and the response to the concern. But those are the only two ways that we can propose constitutional amendments.
Yeah, and I will, because I am here for the League as well, I will mention that the League of Women Voters has a very solid position against an Article 5 constitutional convention, precisely for the reasons you've outlined here. There is no guarantee it will not go off the rails. I myself have testified against resolutions to that in front of the House of Representatives, as have my predecessors as presidents of the League of Women Voters of Utah. So yeah, the fact that the one precedent we have is let's throw it all out, that is a bit concerning there. I'm interested in how originalists talk about things like, oh, slavery or the role of women. I mean, what is the possible justification for originalism when we grapple with things like that?
So, part of what originalists advocate is, you're really talking about an interpretation of something that isn't clear, right? And so when you look at the Constitution, it's not a very long document. It's, I think, without amendments, it's under 5,000 words, and with amendments, it's maybe 7,800 words. That's not very long. So there's a lot of stuff that is not in there. So obviously, the Supreme Court, being tasked with interpreting the Constitution and our laws, is charged with coloring in the lines and interpreting what certain provisions mean, or things that are left out, how they square with what is in the document. But then there's the argument that, well, the surest way to change the Constitution is an amendment, or if Congress wants to do something, not quite as long lasting as that, by passing a law. So we have amendments that have done away with slavery. We have amendments that have empowered, or I should say, protected women's voting rights. Even if it doesn't explicitly grant them, it protects them if they have it. So there have been changes to it through the constitutional process. But originalism tends to focus more on original interpretations of things that are murky, that haven't been clarified explicitly by law or explicitly by an amendment. And so that's kind of how it operates. It operates, especially, a great example of this is gun reform. So for over 200 years, it was understood that the Second Amendment pertained to militias. Why? Because literally the beginning of the amendment is a well-regulated militia. And courts, either directly or in passing, reaffirmed that over time in the 1930s and other court cases, federal cases dealing with the Second Amendment. It wasn't until 2008 in the court case, DC District of Columbia versus Heller, that the Supreme Court clarified for, again, the very first time, that the right to own a gun, in this case, in the home for self-defense, is completely unconnected to eligibility for or membership in a militia. So that is a new interpretation as of 2008. And since that ruling and several others, McDonald v. Chicago, they expanded that to the local level. Caetano, Massachusetts, they expanded that to other types of weapons. Even recently, the Bruin ruling, continually the court has reaffirmed that right. But it was a fundamental change in 2008, and that was really due to a originalist interpretation of the Second Amendment. And this is sort of the crux of originalism, is that there's plenty of research to show that that wasn't the original interpretation, but it was used as a justification for it. So originalism, really at its core is kind of amorphous ideology that's only a couple decades old, that allows, the Constitution, and this is in my opinion, to be twisted in ways that benefit whoever is twisting it.
It does seem to be very relative in how it is applied. Amorphous is a very good way to put that, I think. And so what then we have is a whole bunch of activist court rulings, which most originalists also have problems with. it seems like a sticky wicket, this originalism.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's something that can be shaped in whatever way a justice wants to, get whatever they want out of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. So the other movement that we grapple with a lot here in Utah and in the Intermountain West as a whole is federalism. There are multiple definitions to that word. There's the federal government, there's the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers, and then there's the Federalist Society. There are a lot of things here. So help us tease out those concepts.
Sure. So federalism in its most simple form is really, one jurisdiction that has overlapping governments. So people in Utah, both having a federal government and a state government. And those governments, some of the things that they have the power to do in the Constitution overlap, and some of them have clear separation. And I think the best or the clearest description of federalism is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is the final amendment of the Bill of Rights. And it specifically says that, if it is not a power that is in here explicitly given to the federal government, if it is not something that the Constitution says the states can't do, then it's left up to the states and the people. And so you really get through the 10th Amendment like a clear line in the sand between what is a federal government power and what is a state and local government power. And like I said, sometimes those things overlap and feed into each other. For example, something that is not mentioned in the Constitution is education. So it really is a state and local government issue. But, Congress has the ability in the Constitution to raise money, raise revenue through taxes, and fund things for the common defense and the general welfare. And so general welfare includes things like education. So the federal government can fund education efforts in states and local governments and do that in the form of grants, either tied to a specific thing or with the varying degrees of strings attached to that money. Result in different policies, but the idea that it's one location or group of voters that have multiple governments affecting their lives. Federalism, in the sense of, the word federal in terms of like federalist and anti-federalist, is people who supported or didn't support the Constitution, the creation of this federalist system, and then the Federalist Society is really a whole other issue. It's a much longer Zoom that I don't know if we have the time to get into, but I don't know if, again, I'm dipping into my own personal opinion here. I don't know if the goals and the changing objectives of that organization warrant that word.
What I hear a lot in terms of federalism discussed these days is really a states' rights issue. They're asserting states' rights. And of course, there is this inherent tension between what entity has jurisdiction over a person or a place. We see that a lot here in the West. And so I want you to go back to that 10th Amendment again and just, can you plumb a little bit deeper into that? Because that seems to be what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, well, when the Constitution was being written, there were significant concerns among a lot of the delegates that the creation of a federal government was the antithesis of what they were leaving behind in Europe. They didn't want a giant national government, and they were worried about what a leader of that government, somebody who was command of the Army and the Navy, could possibly do to states and groups, factions, within states or across state lines. And so it was really there was a hesitancy among a lot of the delegates to vote to ratify the Constitution in the first place. You needed 9 of the 13 existing states to ratify it in order for it to take effect. And so, James Madison, being one of the people who wrote the Federalist Papers and being someone who's a champion for the Constitution, was, faced with some delegates in a lot of states that didn't want to vote for something. So he promised them, in exchange for the ratification votes for the original Constitution, that he would add a Bill of Rights. At the time, a lot of states had their own bills of rights, so he thought that it was, I guess, a duplicate to have a federal Bill of Rights in addition to the existing state Constitution Bill of Rights. But he, after a lot of conversations with delegates and legislators in states, he agreed that he would add a Bill of Rights in exchange for the ratification votes. And so there ended up becoming enough votes to ratify the Constitution. And so the Bill of Rights, really the goal of it is to clearly delineate where the federal government ends and individual rights begin. So in the spirit of that, it's sort of and the irony is that originally they started with 19 amendments. So James Madison wrote 19 of them. I think 17 of them made it through the House, 12 of them made it through the Senate. And then the states ratified 10 of those 12, and that became the Bill of Rights. But like originally, the amendment that we think of as the First Amendment was really the Third Amendment in that list. So anytime somebody says, well, they put the First Amendment first for a reason, not that I don't support free speech, I do, but it was actually originally the Third Amendment. It became the First Amendment just by chance, by what states ratified the amendments. So that is sort of the compromise that led to this Bill of Rights. And then the final one of those amendments being like a clear line in the sand between what the federal government can and can't do and what the states can and can't do. And it's pretty clear. Now, obviously, there are things that Congress has done that are not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and that's given to it by a clause that's often what's called the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause, that says Congress can pass laws in order to carry out the powers that are listed here. So that sort of stretches Congress's powers, which is hence the elastic clause. But I think the 10th Amendment is the clearest place where the Constitution specifies like what is the responsibility of the federal government and what is the responsibility of state governments and local governments.
Okay, that makes sense. I want to delve into some amendments and individual rights. Voting rights. Let's talk about those. I was shocked, truly shocked the first time I turned to the Constitution and read it, looking to find the phrase that guaranteed my fundamental right to vote. It wasn't there. At least it wasn't in the way I expected. Tell me a little more about how our voting rights show up in the Constitution.
So it's true that I'll go back to the very original text, right? So before the amendments, we're talking about three branches of government, and I'll work backwards in terms of least democratic to most democratic. So least democratic being Supreme Court justices that we have never been able to elect directly. The president, at the time, in the early days of the Constitution, a lot of states didn't allow a popular vote to choose the electors. The legislature just chose the electors themselves. In fact, it wasn't until 1880 that every state allowed a popular vote to choose the electors. At least some states, for the first 100 years under the Constitution, chose the electors themselves, and they did not use a popular vote to help determine that. And then until 1913, we didn't elect our senators directly. State legislators chose senators. So the only part of the Constitution, at least for the federal government, where ordinary citizens were allowed to elect their leaders was for the House of Representatives, hence the term the People's House. It was the only opportunity to directly elect representatives of the federal government. And the thing that's, I really didn't fundamentally understand this until I did all this research and wrote this book, is that it really completely, it says that you have to use elections to choose members of the House, but it entirely leaves up who can and can't vote to each individual state. And it says that if you are allowed by your state to vote for your state House representatives, you are then allowed to vote for your state's U.S. House representatives. So, the term in a lot of states is state House, sometimes it's state assembly. But if you're allowed to vote in the representatives for the lowest house in your state, then you can vote for U.S. House representatives. And another thing I was pretty surprised to learn is that it wasn't until, a few years after the Constitution, really going into the early 1800s, even the 1820s and 30s, that a lot of states didn't yet explicitly ban women from voting. In fact, New Jersey didn't outlaw women voting until 1807. So, a good almost 20 years, 18 years at first that women were allowed to vote in New Jersey, and a number of states allowed at the time free African Americans, which was a minority of all African Americans in the country at the time, but free African Americans were able to vote in many states until the early 1800s. But then what happened is you had state constitutions starting to ban those people, African Americans, women, from voting. They started to pass and some of these state constitutional provisions were in existence at the time the Constitution was written, specifically in southern states, but more and more states began to adopt them, banning women from voting or banning anyone who wasn't a property owning a white male from voting. But it really is, reading the Constitution, a lesson in that our voting rights originally and to this day are enumerated in state constitutions. It's not in the federal Constitution. And if you look at the language of the famous voting rights amendments, the 15th, the 19th, the 24th for poll taxes, the 26th for people 18 and up, it doesn't specifically say that if you are a woman, you get the right to vote. If you are 18 and up, you get the right to vote. If you are unable to pay a poll tax, you get the right to vote. The language is your right to vote can't be denied or abridged. So if you currently have the right to vote, it can't be taken away because of your sex. It can't be taken away because of your age or your ability to pay a tax or the color of your skin. But it doesn't explicitly grant it. And so that's why you have a lot of states, that have different laws around felony disenfranchisement. Some states make it nearly impossible to get those rights back if you're convicted of a felony, even sometimes low-level felonies. So there are, workarounds that had to happen in a slightly defeatist sense, because again, you had to get a lot of states to agree to these amendments in order to pass them. And without some sort of loophole that could be exploited, some of these states wouldn't have voted to ratify these amendments.
Is this where we get into the concept of positive and negative rights?
Yeah, the idea being that something, cannot be denied or cannot be taken away versus the affirmative rights of you get, it's very rare in the Bill of Rights, really in any of the amendments, but especially the Bill of Rights, that positive rights occur, right? It's like, you can't have cruel and unusual punishment. You can't be your person or your house be searched or seized, without a warrant. But it's very rare that you actually get positive rights. I think it's the Sixth Amendment that specifically says, like, you get certain rights in jury trials, affirmative rights. But there really is a lot of negative rights, and again, that is because it has to interplay with state constitutions at the time.
Okay. Yeah, Utah is one of those interesting voting outliers. We women had the right to vote in Utah before we joined the Union, and then our Constitution disenfranchised us for a while. Then it came on back. So I guess that's a hopeful thing that we can take from all of this, is that we do see some expansion sometimes. And of course, we need to note in all of our discussions about voting, this is talking about the Constitution. There is all kinds of legislation, most notably the Voting Rights Act, that affects our ability to vote and who can vote and how as well.
Yeah, I mean, Congress has the ability to enforce these voting rights amendments. Obviously, the 1965 Voting Rights Act made things a lot more equal, because even after the 15th Amendment in 1870, very few states, especially in the South, allowed African-American women to vote. Barely any of them did. None of them did. And there were also ways to get around allowing African-Americans to vote, with things like, as I mentioned earlier, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, whites-only primaries, things that tried to exploit any constitutional loopholes to effectively continue to disenfranchise people of color.
We are at the point where we're going to pivot to questions and answers. I've had a couple of questions drop into the Q&A box. And I want to remind people, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen. Open that up. If you've got a question, drop it in there and I will ask Ben. We had some sent in advance as well. I'm going to start with this one. Some assert, Ben, that the Equal Rights Amendment is merely symbolic and doesn't really add any real protections to women. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So there is an argument that if there was an equal rights amendment, there would be stronger protections, discrimination protections, protections for any of things around abortion laws in different states for women. So there's something that I was really surprised to learn is the difference between suspect classes and quasi-suspect classes. And this is something that comes out of legal scholarship, but the idea that there are some classes in the Constitution that are explicitly protected more so than others. And this is classes of people, can't be discriminated based on your religion, based on your skin color, national origin. But sex is not one of those things. And so it's treated as a quasi-suspect class, meaning it doesn't get the same level of scrutiny that those other classes do. So there's strict scrutiny, there's intermediate scrutiny, and there's rational basis, which is basically, how seriously, I guess in the shortest way, how seriously the Supreme Court looks at laws that potentially discriminate or disenfranchise these groups. And the truth is that without explicit constitutional protections for women or people based on their sex, they are not at that top tier of protections that do exist for people based on their skin color, national origin, or religion. And so they have not been treated when it comes to Supreme Court cases over time in the same way with the same level of protection. So the advocacy for an equal rights amendment that it would specifically establish that it is not okay to discriminate against people because of their sex, that would elevate sex to a suspect class deserving of the highest level of Supreme Court scrutiny for violations.
Right. I want to talk a little bit more about the Equal Rights Amendment. It is one of the two proposed amendments that I can think of that have had expiration dates put on them. And so we're at an interesting point where we have states who have ratified, and I may be mistaken, but I think we have closed in on that number. However, there's this expiration date issue with the ERA. Will you delve into that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, one slight correction. It's a lot more than two amendments that have had expiration date.
My apologies.
Really, in the last, it's no worries. It's the last 100 years or so. The amount of time given for enough states to ratify the amendment is 7 years. So in a lot of amendments over the last 100 years, you'll see, if it hasn't, expired, if it hasn't been ratified in 7 years, it expires.
Okay.
So the Equal Rights Amendment, yes, did have an expiration date originally that ended up being 1979. Not enough states ratified it by that, but Congress extended the date to 1982, I believe, and still not enough states had ratified it. However, if you go back and look at the amendments that are currently in the Constitution with expiration dates, the expiration dates are in the body of the amendment. They're usually, it's like, part one, you can do this or can't do this. Part two, there's an expiration date of 7 years. The Equal Rights Amendment, the expiration date is not actually in the body of the amendment, it's in the introduction to the amendment. So the question is, if this is not actually in the amendment, but just in the introductory language, is it legally binding? And so that is what led, 3 additional states, one of them being Virginia, I think Nevada, and I want to say Illinois. You can fact check me on that, but in 2020, they suddenly got 38 states, the necessary number to ratify the amendment. The question becomes, well, is the expiration date valid or is it not? And so that is what Congress has the ability to pass a law around to clarify. I imagine if they did pass such a law, that it would be challenged and it would go to the Supreme Court. I think that because it is not, it is in the introduction to the Constitution or the amendment and not actually in the amendment, there's a strong argument to say that it is not legally binding in the same way that the preamble to the Constitution is the introduction to the Constitution. It's not a legally enforceable part of the Constitution. But then you also have, justices like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who have said that, at this point, it's worth starting over and starting from scratch. But, one thing that I've seen is it's incredibly difficult to change the Constitution. And the frustration around how hard it is to change the Constitution is something that is shared by people across the political spectrum. There was an experiment recently that the Constitution Center, the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia did, where they gathered legal scholars of conservative ideology, of the liberal ideology, and a libertarian ideology to see if they could agree on new constitutional amendments. And they agreed on 5. These different ideologies, very different ideologies, agreed on language for 5 amendments. And one of those was to make it slightly easier to change the Constitution. So my own personal opinion is that if it's in the introduction, it's not in the amendment, Congress has the ability to clarify that. It would get challenged. But that is the reason why you see people right now, because it has the necessary 38 states, fighting to make that clarification.
Okay. All right. States and how we elect the president. You talked a little bit about how we elect the president, and you talk in OMG WTF at some length about presidential primaries and how they affect the election and what's really in the Constitution, because we've got a couple of states here, Iowa and New Hampshire, who have a lot of power, and parties that have a lot of power, but I'm not seeing much in your book or in that constitutional language justifying that power.
They don't talk about primaries at all. There's no discussion of presidential primaries, and the current order of states is kind of an accident. Iowa's been going, had, at least in the Democratic Party, had been going first since the 1970s. And it really is just states passing laws and making deals with the major political parties in order to solidify their place in the order. And obviously, this year, Iowa is still first for the Republican Party. It is no longer first for the Democratic Party. South Carolina goes first for the Democratic Party. But getting back to, states, and representatives of states being hesitant to change things that benefit them, being an early primary state is a pretty big economic boost to your state. There are a lot of people traveling to Iowa to campaign for months in advance of the Iowa caucus. There are a lot of people eating at local restaurants. There are a lot of people staying at hotels. And there are a lot of TV ads being bought on local TV stations in Iowa. It is at least a 9-figure infusion into the Iowan economy. In fact, if you look back at 2020, $100 million were spent in totality among the candidates on Iowa TV ads alone, not to mention traveling to the state, producing events in the state, hiring local vendors to produce campaign events, going, like I said, restaurants, hotels. That stuff adds up over the course of months and months and months around a lot of candidates. So it is a huge economic boon to a state. So I understand why Iowa doesn't want to get rid of that, even though the argument against them going first, at least in the Democratic Party, is that they're not representative of the Democratic electorate. So they wanted a state that was. But I can understand why people in Iowa are pretty angry about it. And, over time, it becomes part of the state culture. Same thing with New Hampshire being the first primary and Iowa being the first caucus. The citizens take it seriously. They know the impact that they have being an early primary state and propelling people to the nomination. And so they take it very seriously, but it's also worth mentioning the economic benefit that they get to being an early primary state.
Yeah, so if we want changes there, that's really a private process almost then, since we're not talking about real law here, except for their state laws.
Yeah, they're talking about their state laws, that they just sort of declare that they're going to go first in the primaries. Other states don't have to honor that, and the party doesn't have to honor that. And we just saw that switch happen with the Democratic Party going with South Carolina instead of Iowa. Also, there are some states that, maybe could use that, economic boon. Iowa's gotten it for 50 years or so. Maybe it's time another state got this. I mean, I think about the state, that goes the last this year, the U.S. Virgin Islands. That might be a better place to go in, February than Iowa or New Hampshire, and have the candidates, campaign there, especially since the Virgin Islands doesn't get to vote in the general election. Maybe let's give their say in the primary, give it a little bit more weight. And who doesn't want to see everybody, with their shirt off, walking around the beach, trying to make their case to voters. So I'm a big believer in mixing up the order and making it more fair, for any party.
DC, Washington, DC, and voting rights in Washington, DC. This is a particularly painful issue for people who live in Washington, DC. Talk a little bit more about what's been done to try to get them voting rights, and the fact that they just don't really have much power, do they?
Well, they did get electoral votes in 1960. Thanks to the 23rd Amendment. But yes, Washington, D.C. pays a lot of money in federal tax. They pay billions. I think it's something like 20 some odd $1 billion in federal tax. They pay more federal tax than over 20 states do. In fact, they pay more federal tax than the lowest 4 or 5 states combined. But they have 0 representatives in the House who can vote on laws. They have 0 senators. And it's effectively taxation without representation. And there have been, there was also an amendment, an effort to give DC voting rights in the late 70s and early 80s. That amendment failed around the same time as the ERA, at least the initial version of the ERA. And there have been many efforts to make Washington, D.C. a state. And recent polling has shown that 85% of residents of Washington, D.C. want to be a state. But it is up to Congress whether or not to make it a state. And Congress has decided that it does not want to make D.C. a state. I would argue largely for political reasons. There is nothing to prevent, in the Constitution, there's nothing to prevent Congress from shrinking the size of the Capitol, the federal enclave, to the 2-mile, radius or area around the mall and, the Capitol and the White House, and making the surrounding land a state. But for whatever reason, in my opinion, political reasons, Congress has decided not to do that.
Religion. It's mentioned in the Constitution, but not quite the way a lot of people think it is. Talk a bit about the separation of church and state.
So I would say, as I mentioned before, there are some things that really surprised me in the Constitution. I think the most surprising thing to me is that the Constitution never mentions God, not once. It doesn't even refer to God. The closest it gets to referring to God is in the preamble when it talks about blessings. But unlike the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from, divine up above, the Constitution does not mention or even allude to God. And I find that strange because you look at our money and it talks about God. You think about the Pledge of Allegiance that since 1952, I believe, has had the word God in it. But there is a clear separation of church and state in the Constitution, and not just the fact that it omits God. It doesn't mention any specific religion. In fact, it goes, in my opinion, out of its way to make sure that religion does not mix with government. In Article 6, you cannot be made to take some sort of religious test in order to serve in the federal government. Every time that senators or the president, have to swear an oath to something, they're also given the opportunity to do affirmation, which is a non-religious promise that you're going to uphold the duties of the office. You look at the First Amendment that goes out of its way to say that Congress cannot, establish or ban a religion. So you have many, many instances of the people who wrote the Constitution drawing, a clear separation of church and state. And I think people don't realize that.
Yeah. We would agree. Ben, I've got one final question here. It's my favorite question for you, and I was going to ask it myself, but somebody chimed in with it. What's your favorite amendment?
I would say, and this is a weird answer, I would say the Ninth Amendment. And the reason I think the Ninth Amendment, which is an often overlooked amendment, is so important is that it acknowledges what is in the Constitution cannot be, basically the rights that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. What's in the Constitution can't be used to deny rights that also exist for people that may not be in there. And I think it is James Madison sort of being forward thinking and humble about the fact that this is an incomplete list of rights. This is an incomplete document. There are more things that people have the right to do, say, be, that are not listed in here, and those will be added and filled by future amendments. So I think that it is, for what I imagine to be a very self-confident group of white gentlemen that wrote this document, it's a little bit of hubris, saying that they don't have all the answers. They know that they didn't list every right in here and that there are others. And what is in here can't be used to deny those rights that they left out.
Yeah, I like that amendment too. And in a way, it seems to me like it's a reinforcement of what we've talked about with Article 5, the acknowledgement that, hey, we guys in this sweaty room in Philadelphia, we just don't know what's going to come up. So we've got to throw that out to the future and to the people.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, the Constitution is such a marvelous document. Until I actually sat down and read it, and then I dug in, I didn't quite understand how it was structured, this set of articles it was, how the government works, and then the amendments, which are how the people are, and what an enormous act of trust it was for a ruling class to say, yes, go forth, America, and take on this grand experiment and make us proud. I think in educating the public the way you've been, the way you've mobilized voters, you have done that. That's why Catherine Bealey thinks you're one of us. And I would have to agree. So if there's one thing that I could say, one call of action at the end of this this wonderful webinar is, everybody, I see a lot of people walking around with their little pocket constitutions. Read about the Constitution and read the Constitution. Ben's book is great. As a bookseller, I'll say Akil Reed Amar is just knocks your socks off, but it's a heavy slog. There's a lot out there to help us activate ourselves and others. And of course, more than anything else, register people to vote, then get out to vote yourselves. Ben, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you to Dr. Deborah Turner, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And thank you to everybody who joined in and asked such great questions. This is great fun, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just wanted to add that, there is a kids-safe version of my book. It is just simply called What Does the Constitution Say, for ages 8 to 12. And in July, I recently found out that there's going to be a paperback version of my book released for high school.
Fantastic. And thank you. What a bad bookseller I am to not mention your kids' book. I'm so
You're
sorry.
fine.
I haven't bought the July list, so I'm not surprised about that. But oh, yes, Ben's kids' book is great. So pick that up for your youngins. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.